Welcome to Module 3 in our study of the wilderness mentality. In Part 1 is Israel in Egypt, the state of the unredeemed, and this is the third module of Jehovah's heritage delivered. In Module 1 we talked about the fact that the people of God were enslaved, and the second module that God remembered them. And now in this study is their deliverance, and this will conclude Part 1. In our very next session we'll begin issues in their lives as they were in the land of bondage. In the third chapter of Exodus, in verse 8, the Lord said, "So I now have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land, into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Now, obviously, it would be some time before they accomplished that, but that, of course, was his ultimate mission. And in chapter 14, verses 13 and 14, Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance." In other words, the older translation says, the salvation of the Lord will bring to you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you need only to be still. The very measure which Pharaoh took to destroy the nation of Israel by killing the baby boys and throwing them into the Nile eventually led to their deliverance, because of that same Nile River that Moses was placed in, and from the waters of the Nile he was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. Had it not been for the command to cast the Hebrew little boys, children, into the river, Moses would never have been rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, nor trained in all the wisdom of Egypt to fit him for his ultimate calling. Yet all throughout this marvelous story, there pursues a natural course. That is, natural in its progress, but supernatural in its purposes and results. So Dr. Alfred Edersheim wrote in 1876. The sovereign purposes of God included Israel's deliverance. Not just remembering them, not just hearing their cry, but delivering them. And so again, in Genesis 15, God said to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will come out. And of course the idea will come out of Egypt. This is chapter 15, verses 13 and 14. Now in back of a purpose or of a principle, there must be a plan. And we begin to see this as it unfolds in the lives of the children of Israel and in Egypt itself. And one of the things I would say just at this point is that oftentimes as God's plan is being unfolded for something much better to come to you later, there are some very serious circumstances that must be dealt with. As an example, when Moses told Pharaoh to let the children go, he said these people must have too much leisure on their hands, and so we need to make them work harder. And so they increased the demands, they increased the output, and so the children of Israel had the right to come to Moses and say, "Man, what are you doing to us? I thought you were here to help us to be delivered from this place." And instead, he's making it too hard, and we can't stand this. Often, this is the case in ones of lesser faith, when they're undergoing the tests that are required, that are necessary, in order for us to be a part of God's plan of deliverance. And so, humanity is most often unaware of the ultimate outcome or blessing that God has in mind for them while they're in the midst of the battle. It's just like being on stage and having to judge the play at the same time. God's timetable is sometime delayed, but it's not defeated. A microcosm is the life of Joseph, seen only by Jehovah. As I mentioned earlier, it was only God who, by the dreams Joseph had, knew what the ultimate outcome of his life would be. But in the course of those years of getting to the end, there was much trouble, sorrow, heartache, and every reason in the world for Joseph to wonder, "God, have you left me? Where are you?" And so Job is a classic example of the move of God outside of the vision of man, while man is in the middle of the battle. I've often said that the greatest intergalactic battle that's ever been fought on this planet was between God and the devil over Job. And yet God didn't email Job ahead of time and say, "Son, some strange things are going to happen to you, and I want you to be particularly aware of them and alert to them." No, that's not how it plays out. in the course of life and tests that come and go, to the point that Job lost everything that he had, and he was able still to worship God, the last verse of the first chapter. And the only way he could do this is because he understood that he was an overseer, not the owner. He was in charge of God's property, but God was the owner of it. The domain belonged to God. Job was given dominion over those things. And that's still the principle of kingdom issues today. So all the animals that were lost, all the things that were stolen from Job, even the loss of his children, God stood the loss. Job was a great steward and just lost his job for a few days. But it's in this test that the difficult things that comes forward. God's timetable, again I repeat, is delayed but never defeated. It's when you're in the middle of the battle that the tests really come. The sovereign God planned Israel's deliverance, just as he heard their cry, and it would be on his timetable. Now, in order for us to understand some of this deliverance, not only was it the birth of Moses, was it his great education that he received in Pharaoh's house, but then the 40 years that he was in the wilderness, there being tested. Then comes the call, the burning bush, the bush which does, it appears to be burning and yet it doesn't. And it is at this time, for the first time of which we have record, that God sets forth and says something to Abraham had not been said before him. When Abraham asks for his identity, he said, "Who may I tell the people?" After God finally said, "Son, I'm sending you." And Job made all kind of excuses, but God still held forth, and Moses answered when he understood that it was his mission. And he said, "Then who can I tell the people whom has sent me?" And then God says, "I am that I am. I am that I am." That's not a name. That's not a name. There are many qualifications of God. We call them attributes, and really that's not maybe the right way to look at it. Those are different experiences in which you can see God. And an attribute would, at least from a philosophical standpoint, include the possibility of other parts not being there. And so there's a word that I use in reference to God, M-A-X-I-M-A-L, maximal. He possesses love. He possesses wisdom. He possesses strength and goodness in a maximal way. That is such that leaves no place for a shadow. It's interesting that James, brother of Jesus, would say, "With whom there is no shadow of turning." And so when we think of the sovereign God, that he planned Israel's deliverance, it first began by preparing Moses, the situation that led up to his life, then his training, and then the burning bush, and then the excuses, the hesitance, and finally he accepts the call and he leaves Midian. I believe that he leaves his wife and 2 sons with her father Jethro, and will pick him up in 18 and 19 of the book of Exodus. Then he goes before Pharaoh that we believe is Ramesses II. And again, modern scholarship has tried to come up with a different date than the traditional one. The dates that I use are the traditional ones, and they namely are this. If the call of Abraham is 1921 BC, and according to the scriptures, the law was given 430 years later, this would be 1491. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, as well as in the Chronicles, it tells us that in the 4th year of Solomon's reign does he begin to build the temple. Now, if this would be 480 years, and there, I agree, is some problem about that particular amount of years in the Hebrew language, but the consensus of scholarship is that 480 years after the law was given, 1491, this would make it 1011. And if this is the 4th year of Solomon's reign, this would mean that David died in it 1015, 4 years earlier. That means that he came to the throne 1055. And Samuel had anointed David before Saul's death. And if David came to the throne 1055, Saul reigned 40 years. We're moving backward because that's the way time was counted. This would mean that Samuel anointed Saul at about 1015 rather. At 1015, and then he died at 1000 1055, and David came to the throne in 1055, died at 1015, and I'm sorry, 975. And so this is how it works out. And this would mean that Solomon then dies at about 975. And I have the 20 kings of Israel, which were destroyed by the Assyrian king in 726-24 by Shalmaneser IV and Sargon II, and the 20 kings of the Judean line. That goes another 140 years later when Nebuchadnezzar II comes into Jerusalem 3 times, 597, rather 605, 601, or 597 or 601. There's some problem with that date, but then the good date is 586 BC when he comes a 3rd time and destroys the Temple of Solomon utterly, and takes thousands into Babylonian captivity. And it will be Cyrus the Great in 539 that makes a decree that the Jews can come back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and begin the 2nd temple, which is known as Zerubbabel's temple, which was completed in 516. So those are good dates that I use. 1011, the 4th year of Solomon. Then 1015, the death of David. 1055, the coronation, or the time when David came to the throne. 1095, when Saul had been anointed by Samuel. And this is all a part. This is all a part of God's plan and the history of dealing. And so I have in the study guide that some of you may want to use as you go through these lectures on page 16, that a later Exodus is discussed by some. Now, there were plagues when Moses then goes into Ramesses II and talks about delivering my people. This is a strange thing for a shepherd, an 80-year-old shepherd, to begin just to go up to one of the strongest powers on the face of the earth and make demands of this sort. It would be unheard of. And it's in the 12th chapter of the book of Exodus that I want to read a few verses here that I think are so remarkable to me, and I just enjoy them. And this, of course, is in the 10th plague, and I'll talk about the plagues in a moment. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on a throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of livestock. Pharaoh and all his officials, all the Egyptians, got up that night, a loud wailing in Egypt. There was not a house without somebody dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. This is verse 31. Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you've requested. Take your flocks and your herds as you've said, and go, and also bless me. Now, there are some serious things to happen before this occurred, but the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and to leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we're going to all die. I'll come back, and I want you to look at this in verses 30. Actually in 12, in verse 40 here. Now the length of the time that the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. I've mentioned 400 years twice earlier, and it's a time we somewhat rounded off. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day that Jacob had walked into that country on his own. That's what I wanted you to see. All of the Lord's divisions left Egypt, because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt. On this night. That's why it said earlier. It took after God and Moses had gotten things arranged. In one day, 2,550 men, all their wives and children and their flocks and herds, left Egypt, and I'll talk about that as they're beginning to leave. On this night, all the Israelites are to keep vigil, to honor the Lord for the generations to come. But on that very day, isn't it interesting? 430 years to the very day, these things are beginning to take place. Now, what happens between the time that he's called and he first approaches Pharaoh, and this would get us then to what we call the plagues. 1 through 4 of these plagues were to get Pharaoh's attention. When the water was turned to blood, chapter 7, verse 14, and then the frogs, chapter 8 and verse 4, and then the gnats. Some think these were mosquitoes, but in any case, chapter 8, verse 16, and then the flies. And when these plagues are removed, the death, the stench from the death of all these things would be remarkable. Now, beginning with verse 5, in my understanding, it's when now God has Pharaoh's attention, because his soothsayers are no longer able to duplicate some of the things that had been done earlier in Pharaoh's court. And number 6 was the livestock received some kind of intestinal illness, evidently, and died. Chapter 9, verse 1. And the boils came, and these were horrible things, like carbuncles, or huge pimpled blisters on the necks and bodies. Chapter 9, that's verse 8. And then the hail like had never been seen before, so the scripture would tell us in chapter 9, verse 13. And the locusts came after the hail had beaten down everything, and Moses even warned Pharaoh's court, you tell the people to get their flocks and herds in caves or in some kind of buildings, and the animals that are not will survive. And they didn't. But whatever was left of the beaten down trees and branches off of trees in the way of leaves, the locusts came in chapter 10, verse 1, and cleaned up everything. And of course, chapter 10 and verses 22 and 23 was a darkness. But now from about number 5 of these plagues, there had been something like a plexiglass wall, I call it, built around the land of Goshen. Now the first 4 plagues, all of the Israelites, they received the same horrors that all of Egypt did. But beginning with number 5, it seemed that the land of Goshen was exempt. And I'd shared that with you in a previous session, previous scripture. But then, of course, the 10th one is the firstborn, death. I've just read that to you. And so 6 through 10 were to impress emphatically that Jehovah had the power and personal concern for the children of Israel. In chapter 10 of Exodus, verses 22 and 23, so Moses stretched his hand out toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. And no one could see anyone else or leave his place for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. 11, verse 7b would say, then you will know. God said, then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. In Exodus 12, 26 and 7, when your children ask you. Now, one of the things that I want to share as I close this very session is that when they were delivered, as you and I, when we're saved by the grace of God, we want to celebrate. We want it to be a memorial, a reminder. And God, who made you and me with flesh and blood and with faces of clay, we need markers or reminders. I call them markers along the way. And God has chosen. Now, we're not to let those markers think too much of them and allow them to replace God. And further in our study in the wilderness mentality, we'll see that some people got to the place where they thought they could use heathen gods and let that represent the Jehovah. And that's a serious problem in America today. We have allowed certain gods to just be ones that we use in serving Him, and that's called henogamy, when there are lesser gods that are used in an effort to worship the holy God. That won't work. We'll talk about that in further in this study, Lord willing. And so in chapter 12 of Exodus 26 and 7, and when your children ask, what does this celebration mean? I like the word celebration. What does this ceremony mean? Tell them it's the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when He struck down the Egyptians. Then the people bowed down and worshiped. This, of course, is included in chapter 11 as well. The sovereign Lord then completed Israel's deliverance. But now let's pause for just a moment here. In chapter 11, Pharaoh's proclamation. Now the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt, and after that He will let you go from here. And when He does, He will drive you out completely. Verses 7 and 8 of the same chapter, then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Listen, there is a difference between the world of sin and living a life in the church. There's a difference in being in Egypt and being in the wilderness. Now, some may maintain that Egyptian mentality or enslaved mentality while they've been delivered, but the process and purpose of wilderness experience is to have that slave mentality removed. And that'll be a purpose in this study. Go, you and all you people who follow you. After that I will leave. This, of course, is verse 8 of 11. And then in verses 31 and 32 of chapter 12, during the night Pharaoh summoned Moses. I read that in the beginning of this very session. And Aaron, and said, up, leave my people. You and the Israelites go, worship the Lord as you've requested. Now, all along the way, he's made excuses. Go out just a little ways and leave your families. And then take your families, but leave your flocks. And he's made all of these excuses, trying to be in such a way that he knew that the men who go out and worship in the wilderness would have to come back again to get what belongs to them. Now he says, take everything, your flocks, your herds, as you have said, and go. But then he says, bless me along the way. Now, the attitude of the Egyptians at this moment toward the Israelites, in Exodus chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, God said, I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, and you're not going to leave empty-handed. What do you remember? What do you recall that God said both to Abraham and to Jacob? That your children will go in the land, they'll serve the people, they will come out. And he says to Jacob that your people will come out with great possessions. Every woman is to ask her neighbor, and any woman living in her house, for articles of silver and gold, and for the clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and you will plunder the Egyptians. They weren't embarrassed to do that. And God's people are not embarrassed today to ask for articles, for things for God, because they would use this to build a tabernacle ultimately. And then in 12:33 through 36, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added, and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs, wrapped in clothing. And the Israelites did as Moses instructed, and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. And the Lord made the Egyptians, and they were favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. And he plundered the Egyptians, of course. Take my silver, take my gold, take these animals, take these carts, just go. Now, the procession is an interesting thing to me. I call it the road less traveled. In Exodus 12:37, the Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, and there were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Not the highway, but the sea. This would have been the road that the caravans of all the east would have traveled, the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. They didn't go that way, but they went by the way of the wilderness road towards Succoth, and it would be when they arrived there that they have that celebration. They were led by a pillar of fire at night and cloud by day. Now, the attitude of Israel should have been enough for them to have known something about this God. Their firstborn was spared. There was not death and crying, as was in all of Egypt. They were not afraid. Psalm 78. There are 10 chapters of historic Psalms that give us information that these verses in Exodus do not give us, and Deuteronomy when this is discussed. No lame or sick. Those that had been injured building the storehouses of Ramesses and Python, laying on gurneys, they got up and walked out. The only thing they carried with them were the bones of Joseph that he made the people promise, and at least they kept that in mind. They handed that down through the generations. And then when they went back, they took his bones and buried them in Shechem, which is where one of his sons would be, and that would, of course, would be the property of Joseph. Their clothes wouldn't wear out. Their shoes for the long walk. No female would miscarry. And so, beginning with about verse 77 in Psalms through 10 more chapters, I can do this entire wilderness story. And I've done this at different lectures, telling the story that we're not going that far at this particular time. Now, God's sovereign leadership is something to me that is of great importance. How God leads His people. His thoughts are not our thoughts. His ways are not our ways. Isaiah the prophet would say, for as high as the heavens are above the earth, so are God's ways and thoughts above you and me. And so God's sovereign leadership is amazing. He leads whom He calls. He doesn't lead somebody else's servants. He only leads to whom He calls. And this gives value or status for the privilege of being His child. Now, in order for an Israelite to be in right standing with God was to have Abraham's blood in his veins. That made him a son of the covenant. It's interesting that in these days, how people look at this. Some think that they can follow mere traditions, and that this qualifies them for covenant privileges. Others think that by certain works that they can do, that they may earn status before God. There are different attitudes that people have had through the years, some of which are even idolatrous ones, in believing that that will place them in covenant standing with God. But that's not the case. The only means by which God will lead is to be called, and we are told from the Bible that he calls us by the gospel. The gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The only people that went out of Egypt were Abraham's children, Abraham's sons. So far as we know, not one Egyptian went with them. I stand on solid ground making that statement, and it's an interesting one. And so in chapter 13, verses 30, in chapter 13, beginning with verse 3, he is told to consecrate to me every firstborn male. This begins the chapter. Firstborn of everything of the womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether it's man or beast. Then Moses said to the people, commemorate this day. Commemorate this day. In other words, we're going to celebrate. But there is something further that I want to discuss. Now, can you imagine when these people with all these flocks and herds, they're not fighting people, and when there was death in each house, and now 400 years to the very day has finally come, and the Lord has remembered, and the divisions left Egypt. God's people waited 430 years to be free. The brick monuments, storehouses in Egypt stopped. The sound of building and the sound of the mortar buckets stopped. Slaves living in squalor conditions changed. This 80-year-old shepherd, Pharaoh said, go worship your God as you choose. The brickwork, again I repeat, has stopped. No more monuments in Egypt. Those vast heathen temples were no longer built. Verse 32, take your herds and your flocks and your cattle. Verse 33, the Egyptians wanted them to go out. Now the night they left was a night to celebrate. And in chapter 13 and verse 3, he says to remember. And I want you to think about this. Let it be a holiday, a time of great rejoicing. And they left bondage, the bondage of despair, and replaced it with freedom. And Christ took you and me from our Egypt, from a bondage of despair, and in the deliverance, in the new birth, we have the right to celebrate. Christ is Lord. And Lord, never allow me to forget my deliverance. And each one of us needs to say that. And in chapter 14, we would ask the question, why? Well, verse 13 would tell us to observe, to tell your son. And I want to close this session by reading that very section. And number 3, to keep the ordinances which I've given you. In other words, keep my word. And devote to God what he wants. Yahweh brought us out of Egypt, son, the fathers would say. And he stopped us, 1243, stopped us at Sukkoth. And there we observed a feast of thanksgiving. A feast of thanksgiving. And this is where praise begins. I sacrifice because it is for we who live indulged lives are ones who need to be free. We need to be free of many of the hobbies, the habits, the addictions that belong to us. And free people do what they do because of what they're led to appreciate, and not in an attempt to earn. But here's the issue: they have left. They are at Ramesses, and they come to the edge of Yom Suf, Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea, and here's this great body of water before them. Now all of a sudden they hear the rumbling chariots behind them, and this is a great time for them to begin to say, "What have you done? What have you done to us?" But you see, God is in the delivering business, not just the remembering business, but he's in the delivering business of those whom he does remember, of his own people. And so there is a pillar of cloud. Now the cloud then moves from the front of the procession to the back of the procession, and it's like a foggy night, so foggy that all those chariots, 600 chariots, Egyptian chariots, are coming from the rear, and they don't have fog lights on those chariots. And they become confused, and they become so beside themselves that they can't go in and take over the people as they decide after the Israelites leave. Then the Egyptians come to themselves, what have we done? All this free slave labor we've had for all these years, let's go catch them. Let's go run them down. They can't get ahead of us. But there was something they didn't understand, that there was a hand of Jehovah God that's in that cloud that moved behind, and it's interesting that several times in the Old Testament the hinder part or the hinder ward, it's discussed differently. We really don't have anything in the English language to describe just exactly what God was in the back of his, behind his own people. This is picked up in the prophets as well as in the Psalms in different ways. And so when then the people are concerned, they're upset, and they ask, and Moses cries out to God, what you will do? And he says, raise your hand. And he raised that staff. He raised the staff out over the waters, and the waters parted back. And Isaiah will tell us they went through on dry ground. They didn't walk through 6 inches of old blue mud like the bottom of a riverbed would be. And the water was held back. And they walked through, and they'd never seen anything like this. And when they get on the other side, then that's the verse that says, stand still, for this day you will see the salvation of the Lord, the King James Version says. The deliverance of the Lord is what the NIV says. And you will see it this day. And the enemies, you will see them, and they were washed upon the shore, and you'll never see them again. You'll never see them again. Now, it's so sad to me that along the way, as we're coming then into the next part 2 of this study, that they will want to go back. They will want to go back, and I can't deal with that. We'll look into that but they didn't, even though some of them wanted to in their hearts, and they paid for that. But here are those chariots. The wheels run off, and they run together, and they smash, and the waters come back, and they're all drowned. Can you imagine how startling this was? And the people were able to see this. They witnessed this, and there were the dead carcasses laying on the shore and those crumpled up chariots. When God, in other words, the procession, the result or the fruit of God's leadership, God instructed Moses to send one leader from each tribe. Then once they'll get to a certain place, and I'm going to talk about anointed leaders later when we think about this. But the whole issue for you and me in this very hour is for us to understand that in that procession there were some things happened that are beyond our explanation. We can't imagine such a thing, the holiness of a God. God has appointed certain symbols in leadership. Now, and as a result, there was even some of their own people, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, for instance, and the destruction that they went through. There's an entire lecture on that in my faith seminar study. It's module 10, option 3, pages 116 through 120 in a faith seminar study guide. And so why do you serve as you serve? Is it for self, or is it for God's glory? And so obstacles which hinder God's leadership is that it's natural to question authority. We'll discuss that not all believers have equal maturity or ability and gifts of leadership. So no human is without fault. And so sometimes valid criticism can be made to benefit the body when done in the spirit and gentleness of Jesus. In Exodus 20, God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Egypt was a land of bondage because Pharaoh made slaves of God's people. And we too are slaves to whatever has mastered us. Romans 6, verse 16. And as the Jews were delivered from Egypt, so you and I are delivered from sin. Israel was commanded to instruct their children in the realities, the horror, the death, the damage. Yet Jehovah rescued them, and they were to have a celebration and a thanksgiving. We must do similarly to instruct our children of the realities, of the horror, of the damage that can happen in an enslaved place, yet the deliverance that comes through Christ the Lord. And then Romans 6 says, for I reckon that the sufferings of the present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory which shall be revealed in us. So the children of Israel did not sneak out of Egypt. None were poor, sick, or without direction. They had protection and were unafraid. Jehovah delivered them, and he delivers you and me. from the bondage. The battle belongs to the Lord. And I ask you, you have many trials and much pain and panic before you for God to reshape your enslaved mentality, to give you a sense of true freedom. And that's where these next sessions go to. And I want to close this session by reading from the 14th chapter of the book of Exodus, beginning with verse 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back into its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, and the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites went into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on the left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the great power of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses and his servants. And then Miriam and the women of Israel sing the great song of Moses and the Lamb, which will be in the repertoire that the angels and you and I one day will be included in as we sing that great song of deliverance. The horse and the rider hath he thrown in the sea. The horse and the rider hath he thrown in the sea. Beautiful Hebrew poetry. God delivers those whom he calls, who answer his call. And may the glory all be his even now. And I give this to you in Jesus' name. Amen.